The Courage of the Truth, lectures by Michel Foucault at the College of France, given on 1983-84. Lecture 7, given on the 14th of March, 1984, the first hour of Lecture 7. Today I will speak about the cynic life, about the biopolitics as true life. As I tried to show you last week, what seems to me to be both difficult and important to understand in cynicism is the following paradox, which is nonetheless fairly simple in itself. On the one hand, cynicism appears in the form of a set of features which it shares with many philosophies of the time. There is something commonplace and ordinary in the thesis it advances and the principles it recommends. On the other hand, it is stamped by a scandal which has constantly accompanied it, a disapproval which surrounds it, a mixture of mockery, repulsion, and apprehension in reaction to its presence and manifestations. Throughout its existence, from the Hellenistic epoch to the beginnings of Christianity, cynicism was both very familiar and nevertheless strange in the landscape of Greco-Roman philosophy, thought, and society. It was ordinary, commonplace, and it was unacceptable. All in all, we could say that a sizable number of eminent philosophers found it fairly easy to recognize themselves in cynicism and gave a positive image of it. There is some evidence of this in important texts. You remember that Seneca gave a portrait of Demetrius the Cynic, backed up by quotations and references, as one of the most important philosophers of his time. You remember Epictetus, Discourse 69 in Book 3 of the Discourses, presenting his famous portrait of the ideal cynic. Even amongst its declared opponents, there is a positive characterization of a certain form of cynicism. The Emperor Julian, precisely when he is criticizing it, lays claim to cynicism as a universal philosophical standpoint as old as philosophy itself. Lucian, too, despite his harsh criticisms of not only a cynic like Peregrinus, but of practically all philosophers, gives a positive portrait of demoniacs. So, at the same time as philosophers find it so easy to recognize themselves in cynicism, they vehemently distinguish themselves from it by a repulsive caricature. They present it as a sort of unacceptable adulteration of philosophy. Cynicism would be the broken mirror, as it were, for ancient philosophy. It is the broken mirror in which every philosopher can and must recognize himself, in which he can and must recognize the very image of philosophy, the reflection of what it is and should be, and what he is and would like to be. And at the same time, the philosopher sees in this mirror something like a grimace, a violent, ugly, unsightly deformation in which there is no way in which he could recognize either himself or philosophy. All of this amounts to saying, quite simply, that cynicism was seen, I think, as the banality of philosophy. But its scandalous banality. Cynicism made a scandal of philosophy grasped, practiced, and clad in its banality. In conclusion, I would say that in antiquity, cynicism appears to me to be basically like a sort of eclecticism with reverse effects. By this I mean that if eclecticism is the form of thought, discourse, and philosophical choice, which combines the commonest and most traditional features of the different philosophies of an epoch, this is generally so that they can be made acceptable to everyone in the organizing principles of an intellectual and moral consensus. Generally speaking, this is the definition of eclecticism. I would say that cynicism is an eclecticism with reverse effects. It is eclecticism because it does take up some of the most fundamental features found in the philosophies contemporary with it. But it has a reverse effect because it turns this reuse of these features into a shocking practice, which, far from establishing a philosophical consensus, establishes rather a strangeness in philosophical practice and exteriority, and even hostility and a war. The paradox of cynicism is that it formed the commonest elements of philosophy into so many breaking points for philosophy. This is what we must try to understand. How can cynicism be basically what everyone says, and yet make the very fact of saying it unacceptable? This paradox of cynicism, if we can characterize it in this way, is worth some attention for two reasons. The first is that it enables cynicism to be situated in the history or prehistory of what I wanted to outline this year, that of the courage of the truth. It seems to me that cynicism sheds a new light on, gives a new form to that grand old political and philosophical problem of the courage of the truth, which was so important in all of ancient philosophy. We could draw up the following very schematic outline. We first came across the problem of the courage of the truth. This is what I tried to study last year in the form of what could be called political boldness. That is to say, the courage of the Democrat or the bravery of the courtier when they tell the assembly or the prince something other than what this assembly or prince thinks. The political boldness of both the Democrat and the courtier thus consists in saying something other than and contrary to what the assembly or the prince thinks. The politician, if he is courageous, risks his life for the truth against the opinion of the prince or assembly. This is, very schematically, the structure of what could be called the political bravery of truth-telling. We came across a second form of courage of the truth, which I sketched out a bit last year and took up again this year. This is no longer political bravery, but what could be called Socratic irony, which consists in telling people and getting them gradually to recognize that they do not really know what they say and think they know. In this case, Socratic irony consists in risking the anger, irritation, and vengeance of the people, and even being put on trial by them in order to lead them, despite themselves, to take care of themselves, of their souls, and of the truth. The simplest case, political bravery, involved opposing the courage of truth-telling to an opinion, an error. In the case of Socratic irony, it involves introducing a certain form of truth into a knowledge that men do not know they know, a form of truth which will lead them to take care of themselves. With cynicism, we have a third form of the courage of the truth, which is distinct from both political bravery and Socratic irony. Cynic courage of the truth consists in getting people to condemn, reject, despise, and insult the very manifestation of what they accept or claim to accept at the level of principles. It involves facing up to their anger when presenting them with the image of what they accept and value in thought, and at the same time reject and despise in their life. This is the cynic scandal. After political bravery and Socratic irony, we have, if you like, cynic scandal. In the first two cases, the courage of the truth consists in risking one's life by telling the truth. Risking one's life in order to tell the truth. And risking one's life because one has told the truth. In the case of cynic scandal, and this is what seems to me to be important and worth holding on to, isolating, one risks one's life, not just by telling the truth and in order to tell it, but by the very way in which one lives. In all the meanings of the word, one exposes one's life. That is to say, one displays it and risks it. One risks it by displaying it, and it is because one displays it that one risks it. One exposes one's life, not through one's discourses, but through one's life itself. This is the first reason for keeping hold of this cynic scandal in its very structure, which always operates within the framework of the grand theme of having the courage of the truth, but which makes it work in a different way from political courage or Socratic irony. The second reason for focusing for a moment on this problem of the cynic life is that in cynic practice, in cynic scandal, the question cynicism constantly puts to philosophy in antiquity, and also in Christianity or the modern world, the permanent, difficult, and perpetually embarrassing question is basically that of the philosophical life, of the bios philosophicos. If we take up the problem and theme of cynicism on the basis of this great history of parrhesia and truth-telling, we can say that whereas all philosophy increasingly tends to pose the question of truth-telling in terms of the conditions under which a statement can be recognized as true, cynicism is the form of philosophy which constantly raises the question, what can the form of life be such that it practices truth-telling? From the origin of philosophy, and maybe in fact until now, still and despite everything, the West has always accepted that philosophy cannot be separated from a philosophical existence, that the practice of philosophy must always be more or less a sort of life exercise. This is what distinguishes philosophy from science. But while loudly proclaiming that philosophy is fundamentally not just a form of discourse, but also a mode of life, Western philosophy, and such was its history and perhaps its destiny, progressively eliminated, or at least neglected and marginalized, the problem of this philosophical life, which to start with, however, it posited as inseparable from philosophical practice. It has increasingly neglected and marginalized the problem of life in its essential connection with the practice of truth-telling. We can take it that the forgetting, neglect, elimination, and exteriorization of the problem of the true life, of the philosophical life in relation to philosophical practice and discourse, are the effects of or manifest certain phenomena. The absorption and, to a certain extent, confiscation by religion of the theme and practice of the true life has certainly been one of the reasons for this disappearance. It is as if philosophy was able to disburden itself of the problem of the true life to the same extent as religion, religious institutions, asceticism, and spirituality took over this problem in an increasingly evident manner from the end of antiquity down to the modern world. We can take it also that the institutionalization of truth-telling practices in the form of a science, a normed, regulated, established science embodied in institutions, has no doubt been the other major reason for the disappearance of the theme of the true life as a philosophical question, as a problem of the conditions of access to the truth. If scientific practice, scientific institutions, and integration within the scientific consensus are by themselves sufficient to assure access to the truth, then it is clear that the problem of the true life as the necessary basis for the practice of truth-telling disappears. So there has been confiscation of the problem of the true life in the religious institution and invalidation of the problem of the true life in scientific institution. You understand why the question of the true life has continually become worn out, faded, eliminated, and threadbare in Western thought. The question of the true life is always gradually removed from philosophical reflection and practice, except, of course, at some remarkable points and moments. The problem of the philosophical life could perhaps be taken up again from Montaigne to the Aufklärung. For if the traditional history of philosophy, and particularly of classical philosophy, is almost exclusively interested in the problem of the systematic character of philosophical thought and the formal and systematic structure of its truth-telling, there is no doubt that the problem of the philosophical life nevertheless arises with a certain intensity and force from the 16th to the 18th century. After all, Spinoza, read on the improvement of the understanding, in fact puts the question of the philosophical life and the true life at the very source of the philosophical project, and subject to much more precise analysis, we might say that with Spinoza we have, as it were, the last great figure for whom philosophical practice was inspired by the fundamental and essential project of leading a philosophical life. And we could contrast Spinoza and the way in which he lived with Leibniz, who might be the first modern philosopher, inasmuch as for him, far from implying the choice of a philosophical life, as in Spinoza, philosophy always manifested itself and was practiced through a number of what could be called modern activities. He was a librarian, a diplomat, a politician, an administrator, etc. We have there a modern form of philosophical life which could be contrasted with Spinoza's philosophical practice, which implied a true life of a completely other type than that of everyday life. But to tell the truth, we could even argue about Leibniz. Anyway, it would be interesting to study the history of classical philosophy, starting from the problem of the philosophical life, considered as a problem of a choice, which may be identified through biographical events and decisions, but also through the place it is given in the system itself. In any case, I would simply like to suggest that if it is true that the question of being has indeed been what Western philosophy has forgotten, and that this forgetting was made metaphysics possible, it may also be that the question of the philosophical life has continued to be, I won't say forgotten, but neglected. It has constantly appeared as surplus in relation to philosophy, to a philosophical practice indexed to the scientific model. The question of the philosophical life has constantly appeared like a shadow of philosophical practice, and increasingly pointless. This neglect of the philosophical life has meant that it is now possible for the relation to truth to be validated and manifested in no other form than that of scientific knowledge. In this perspective, cynicism as a particular figure of ancient philosophy, as well as a recurring attitude throughout Western history, raises the question of the philosophical life in a peremptory fashion, in the form of scandal. The fact that cynicism is always both inside and outside philosophy, the familiarity and strangeness of cynicism in relation to the philosophy which serves as its context, milieu, vis-a-vis opponent and enemy. The cynic constitution of the philosophical life as scandal is the historical stamp, the first manifestation, the point of departure for what has been, I think, the great exteriorization of the problem of the philosophical life in relation to philosophy, to philosophical practice, to the practice of philosophical discourse. This is why cynicism interests me, and what I would like to pinpoint with it. You can see how, for me, its study can be connected to the question of the practices and arts of existence. It is because it was both the most rudimentary and most radical form in which the question of this particular form of life, the philosophical life, which is obviously only one particular form, but extremely important and central through the problems it poses, was raised. I would now like to study how cynicism posed the question of the philosophical life and how it practiced it. Let us take cynicism in those aspects which are the most common, usual, familiar, well-known, and close to all the philosophies contemporary with it. Once again, going back over some of what I was saying last week, we do not know a great deal about cynicism. the essentials coming from late sources dating from the first centuries CE. Consequently, it is very difficult to know whether there was an evolution of cynicism. It is even difficult to know what the historical reality of the tradition was, and what continuity there was with those semi-legendary figures of Antisthenes, Diogenes, and Crates. I am taking cynicism as it's manifested itself, as it was expressed in the texts of the first 2 or 3 centuries CE, independently of any historical question of chronology, succession, influence, or anything else. At the point of departure of cynic practice, as described in the texts I am talking about, we find a number of very common, standard elements as general, basic principles, which manifestly link cynic practice to the old Socratic tradition on the one hand, and themes in common to other philosophies on the other. First, for cynicism, philosophy is a preparation for life. Certainly a very common and easily recognized theme. For example, the aphorism that to prepare for life one needs either logos or the brokos is attributed to Diogenes. That is to say, either reason, logos, which organizes life, or the cord, brokos, with which one hangs oneself. Either you will hang yourself, or you will prepare your life according to logos. Philosophy is preparation for life. Second, this preparation for life, which again is a very familiar, easily recognizable principle, entails above all else that one takes care of oneself. There are many statements in the Cynics on the importance of this care of self, of the rule, take care of yourself. There is the following anecdote about Diogenes. One day he was on a public square, or on the street corner, speaking seriously of solemn, weighty things, and no one was listening to him. So he breaks off his discourse and begins to whistle like a bird. Straightway, a crowd of curious people gather around him. Then he insults the gaping onlookers, who form a circle around him, telling them that they hurried to listen to foolish things, but that they hardly rushed to hear serious things. There are lots of accounts on the same theme, that one must take care of oneself, which is the only serious thing. Demoniacs, for example. This is cited in Stobaeus. Reprimanded people who went to great pains for their body while neglecting themselves. It is, he said, as if you wanted to look after your house without taking care of those living in it. And Julian, in his discourses, where he tries to give the pure, essential, and valid image of cynicism, says, whoever desires to be a serious cynic must begin by imitating Diogenes and Crates, by taking care of himself. And he employs the famous expression I have quoted so many times: Hoto proteron epimelithes. Diogenes and Crates are therefore teachers of care of self, as we have seen Socrates was. This is again an entirely commonplace and standard theme in philosophy. The third principle we find constantly taken up and repeated by the Cynics, and which is also a completely familiar theme, is that in order to take care of oneself, one must only study what is really useful in and for existence. Diogenes Laertius quotes the remarks of Diogenes the Cynic. The latter was surprised to see the grammarians devote so much study to the morals of Ulysses and to neglect their own, to see musicians tune their lyres so well and forget to tune their soul, to see mathematicians study the sun and moon and forget what is beneath their feet, to see orators full of zeal for speaking well, but never pressed to act well, entirely in the same spirit. Again, in a text quoted by Stobaeus, when someone asks Demonax whether the world was or was not spherical, he replied, "You go to great pains over the subject of the cosmic order, but you are completely unconcerned about your own internal disorder." So, if you want to take care of yourself, it is not the cosmic order, not things of the world, not grammar, mathematics, or music you should study, but things immediately useful for life. That is to say, for the care of yourself. Finally, fourth, one must make one's life conform to the precepts one formulates. According to Diogenes Laertius, Diogenes the Cynic rebuked those who despised wealth, but envied the wealthy. He rebuked those who sacrificed to the gods in order to obtain health, but feasted during these same sacrifices. There can only be true care of self if the principles one formulates as true principles are at the same time guaranteed and authenticated by the way one lives. In all this, you can recognize quite common and traditional principles, but to these four general and common principles which you find in Socrates, as in the Stoics and even the Epicureans, the Cynics add a fifth, which is very different and completely specific to them, singling them out. I referred to this principle at the end of last week. This is the principle that one must haratain to nomisma, alter, change the value of the currency. This is a difficult, obscure principle which has been interpreted in many different ways. We can accept that the expression parek haratain to nomisma means change the currency, but in two senses. a pejorative sense and a positive, or at any rate, neutral sense. It may actually be a dishonest alteration of the currency. It may also be a change of the effigy stamped on the coin, a change which enables the true value of the coin to be re-established. Anyway, in all the doxography and most of the references to cynicism, this principle, with its ambiguous meaning, positive or negative value, is constantly associated with Diogenes and Cynic principles. Thus, Diogenes Laertius gives several versions of the beginnings of Diogenes' life, his vocation, and his philosophical choice. First version: the father of Diogenes was a money changer at Sinope, but he falsified it in the pejorative, negative sense of the term. As a result, his son, Diogenes, was forced to leave the town, to immigrate, and go into exile in Athens. Diogenes Laertius relates other versions around the same theme. According to some, he cites Eubulides. It was Diogenes himself, not his father, who falsified the money. According to still other sources, in reality, Diogenes went to Delphi spontaneously to consult the oracle. In this version, neither he nor his father would seem to have falsified the money, and the oracle is supposed to have told him, falsify the currency, or alter, change the value of the currency. Finally, in a more complicated version, Diogenes Laertius combines the previous versions he has just referred to and says, according to some, in his childhood and youth, Diogenes falsified some coins his father had given him. Here we find again the father in his relation to money, as a result of which the father, as the person responsible for this falsification, was imprisoned and died. Diogenes either exiled himself or was sent into exile as punishment. He went to Delphi and asked the god, "How can I become famous?" To this, the oracle replied, "Alter the currency." You see everything brought together in this account: the father, the falsification of the currency by Diogenes, and then the Delphic precept, alter the currency, paraxan to nomisma. The principle of altering the currency is regularly associated with cynicism and, in the lives of philosophers recounted by Diogenes Laertius, there is a whole series of anecdotes which regularly associate the cynics with money, to its practice and correct or corrupt use. Thus, again according to Diogenes Laertius, Monimus, the first disciple of Diogenes the Cynic, was the servant of a banker and feigning madness, stole some money from him. Crates was supposed to have been an extremely rich man who abandoned the wealth he inherited from his father, distributing the money to the poor, or else, as another version has it, throwing all his inherited cash into the sea. In his Life of Menippus, Diogenes Laertius says that, according to Hermippus, Menippus was a money lender who accumulated a great fortune, but was ultimately ruined by his enemies and, in despair, hanged himself. As for Bion of Borysthenes, who is on the borders of a particular form of Platonism and Cynicism, he recounted, again according to Diogenes Laertius, how his father, having evaded taxation, was sold into slavery with all his family. This is how Bion of Borysthenes became a slave. As you can see, there is very often a story of money, banking, and exchange whenever the cynics are involved. What is important, or what at any rate I would like to stress, is that the principle that you must alter your currency or change the value of your currency is regarded as a principle of life, and even as the most fundamental and typical cynic principle. When Julian, for example, writes his two great discourses against the cynics, he refers at several points to the principle: alter the currency, change the value of the currency. In To the Uneducated Cynics, you remember, I spoke about this last week. Julian presents cynicism as a kind of universal philosophy, the essential features of which are found in all the other philosophies, its basic principles going back not only to Hercules, but even before, to the beginning of humanity. In this same passage, Julian states that, according to him, are the two principles of cynicism. He comments that these two principles go back as far as the Pythian Apollo. These two principles are, in fact, first, know yourself. Second, parakharakson tu nomisma. Revalue your currency, alter your currency, change its value. And he adds that if the first principle with which the cynics are linked and by which they are inspired was not addressed solely to Diogenes, since it was also addressed to Socrates in particular, and even more generally to everyone, it was engraved on the very door of the temple. The principle parakharakson tu nomisma, on the other hand, was addressed to Diogenes alone. So that, according to Julian, of these two great fundamental principles, of these two most universal principles of philosophy, one was addressed to everyone and to Socrates, know yourself, and the other was reserved for Diogenes alone, revalue your currency. In the other discourse, to the cynic Heraclios, recalling once again the two Delphic principles, know yourself and alter the value of your currency, Julian raises the important, interesting question of the relation between these two principles. Must one revalue one's currency in order to know oneself, or is it that by knowing oneself, one can revalue one's currency? Julian opts for the second solution when he says that the person who knows himself will know exactly what he is, and not merely what he passes for being. So the meaning Julian gives to the juxtaposition and coordination of these two precepts would be the following. The fundamental precept is revalue your currency. But this revaluation can only take place through and by means of know yourself, which replaces the counterfeit currency of one's own and others' opinion of oneself with the true currency of self-knowledge. One can handle one's own existence, take care of oneself as something real, and have the true currency of one's true existence in one's hands, on condition that one knows oneself. And Julian comments that when Diogenes obeyed the Pythian Apollo, when he began to get to know himself, the coin he was took on its true value. To get to know himself, Diogenes had to be able to recognize himself and be recognized by others as superior to Alexander himself. This refers to the famous confrontation between Diogenes and Alexander. Alexander says, if I had not been Alexander, I would have liked to be Diogenes. Diogenes replies to him, but I am the true king, the true coin. You see that throughout the history in representation of cynicism, the theme of parakaraxis to nomismatos, the precept parakaraxon to nomisma, change the currency, appears at the heart of cynic experience and practice. There are, of course, a number of interpretations of this principle, essentially around the theme that nomisma, the currency, is also nomos, the law, custom. The principle of altering the nomisma is also that of changing the custom, breaking with it, breaking up the rules, habits, conventions, and laws. It is very likely that this is how it was received and understood. Whatever the original meaning of this expression. So it is this that, in a sense, we should bear in mind. But it seems to me that we can make some headway in the analysis of this principle. Maybe we could clarify the meaning of this expression by recalling the characterization that the cynics seem to have given of themselves when they commented on the term dog, which was applied to them. There are different interpretations of why Diogenes was called the dog. Some are of a local order. It was because of the place Diogenes chose as his home. According to other interpretations, it was because, in actual fact, he led a dog's life. Called dog by others, he took on the epithet himself and declared himself dog. Here again, the origin of the expression is not important. The problem is the value it was given and how it functioned in the Cynic tradition that we can take up to the 1st century CE. And a commentator of Aristotle, but many other authors refer to it, we find the following interpretation of this bios kun ikos, which seems to have been canonical. First, the kunikos life is a dog's life in that it is without modesty, shame, and human respect. It is a life which does in public, in front of everyone, what only dogs and animals dare to do, and which men usually hide. The cynic's life is a dog's life in that it is shameless. Second, the cynic life is a dog's life because, like the latter, it is indifferent. It is indifferent to whatever may occur. It is not attached to anything. It is content with what it has, and has no needs other than those it can satisfy immediately. Third, the life of the cynic is the life of a dog. It received the epithet kunikos because it is, so to speak, a life which barks. A diacritical life, that is to say, a life which can fight, which barks at enemies, which knows how to distinguish the good from the bad, the true from the false, and masters from enemies. In that sense, it is a diakritikos life. A life of discernment, which knows how to prove, test, and distinguish. Finally, fourth, the cynic life is phulaktikos. It is a guard dog's life, a life which knows how to dedicate itself to saving others and protecting the master's life. Shameless life, adiaphoros, indifferent life, diakritikos life, diacritical, distinguishing, discriminating, and as it were, barking life. And phulaktikos, guard's life, guard dog's life. You can see that it is not difficult to recognize a close kinship between these four, once again, canonical characteristics picked out and distinguished in these terms in the traditional representation of the cynics. And those characteristics I tried to identify last week, which traditionally defined the true life. Basically, the cynic life is at once the echo, the continuation, and the extension of the true life, that unconcealed, independent, straight, sovereign life, but also taking it to the point of its extreme consequence and reversal. What is the shameless life, if not the continuation, the pursuit, but also the scandalous reversal of the unconcealed life, the bios aletheis? The life in aletheia, you recall, was a life without concealment, which holds nothing back, a life which was capable of having nothing to be ashamed of. Well, ultimately, this is the shameless life of the cynic dog, the indifferent, adiaphorous life, which needs nothing, which is content with what it has, with what it happens across, with what it is thrown, only continues, extends, takes to the extreme consequence, and scandalous reversal of the unalloyed, independent life, which was one of the fundamental characteristics of the true life. The diacritical, barking life which distinguishes between good and bad, friends and enemies, masters and others, is the continuation, but also the scandalous, violent, polemical reversal of the straight life, of the life which obeys the law, the nomos, the life of the guard dog, of combat and service, which characterizes cynicism, is also the continuation and reversal of that tranquil, self-controlled, sovereign life which characterized the true existence. I will try to develop all this more precisely shortly. What I would like to emphasize now is you can see that the alteration of the currency, the change of its value, which is constantly associated with cynicism, no doubt means something like the forms and habits which usually stamp existence and give it its features must be replaced by the effigy of the principles traditionally accepted by philosophy. But by the very fact of applying these principles to life itself, rather than merely maintaining them in the element of the logos, by the fact that they give a form to life, just as the coin's effigy gives a form to the metal on which it is stamped, one thereby reveals other lives, the lives of others, to be no more than counterfeit, coin with no value. By adopting the most traditional, conventionally accepted and general principles of current philosophy, by making the philosopher's very existence their point of application, site of manifestation, and form of truth-telling, the cynic life puts the true currency with its true value into circulation. The cynic game shows that this life, which truly applies the principles of the true life, is other than the life led by men in general and by philosophers in particular. With this idea that the true life is an other life, vie autre, I think we arrive at a particular important point in the history of cynicism, in the history of philosophy, certainly in the history of Western ethics. We come to the heart of an important problem. If we accept that cynicism is in fact this movement by which life changes as a result of being really and truly, in actual fact, stamped with the effigy of philosophy. In this respect, cynicism was not just the insolent, rough, and rudimentary reminder of the question of the philosophical life. It raised a very grave problem, or rather, it seems to me that it gave the theme of the philosophical life its cutting edge by raising the following question. For life truly to be the life of truth, must it not be an other life? A life which is radically and paradoxically other? It is radically other because it breaks totally and on every point with the traditional forms of existence, with the philosophical existence that philosophers were accustomed to accepting, with their habits and conventions. Will not the true life be a radically and paradoxically other life, since all it will do is implement the principles most commonly accepted in current philosophical practice? Is not and must not the true life be an other life? Is an important philosophical question with long-term significance. Maybe, and again, forgive the schematism. These are hypotheses, dotted lines, outlines of possible directions for work. It could be said that with Platonism and through Platonism, Greek philosophy, since Socrates basically posed the question of the other world, but starting with Socrates, or from the Socratic model to which cynicism referred, it also posed another question, not the question of the other world, but that of an other life. It seems to me that the other world and other life have basically been the two great themes, the two great forms, the great limits within which Western philosophy has constantly developed. Maybe we could put forward the following schema. You remember that Heraclitus, refusing to lead the solemn, stately, isolated, and withdrawn life of the sage, went among the artisans and sat and warmed himself at the baker's oven, saying to those who were astonished and indignant, Kai enthota theos, but the gods are also here. Heraclitus conceived of a philosophy, a philosophical practice, a philosophizing which is fulfilled with the principle of Kai enthota theos. Here too there are gods, even in the baker's oven. Philosophy is fulfilled in the thought of the world itself, and in the form of the common life. But with the Socratic care of self, with the epimelia hoto I have been talking to you about for so long, we see two great lines of development emerging along which Western philosophy stretches out. On the one hand, on the line which, as all the Neoplatonists recognized, starts from the Alcibiades, the care of self leads to the question of the truth and specific being of that which one must be concerned about. What is this me, this self, we must care about? These are the questions we encountered in the Alcibiades. And they led the dialogue to the discovery of the soul as we must attend to, the soul we must contemplate. What do we discover in the mirror of the soul contemplating itself? The pure world of truth, that other world, which is the world of truth and the world to which we must aspire. And to that extent, on the basis of the care of self, through the soul, in the contemplation of the soul for itself, the Alcibiades founded the principle of the other world, l'autre monde, in the marked the origin of Western metaphysics. On the other hand, still on the basis of the care of self, but starting now from the lash rather than the Alcibiades, taking the lash as the point of departure. The care of self does not lead to the question of what this being I must care for is in its reality and truth, but to the question of what this care must be and what a life must be which claims to care about self. And what this sets off is not the movement towards the other world, but the questioning of what, in relation to all other forms of life, precisely that form of life which takes care of self, must and can be in truth. This other line of development gives to the question of the art of living and of the way of living, if not its origin, at least its philosophical foundation. We do not encounter Platonism and the metaphysics of the other world on this line. We encounter cynicism and the theme of an other life. These two lines of development, one leading to the other world and the other to an other life, both starting from the care of self, are clearly divergent. Since one rises to Platonic and Neoplatonic speculation and Western metaphysics, while the other gives rise to nothing more, in a sense, than cynic crudeness. But it will revive as a question which is both central and marginal in relation to a philosophical practice, the question of the philosophical and true life as an other life. Must not the philosophical life, the true life, necessarily be a life which is radically other? Clearly, it should not be thought that these two major lines of divergence, which are, I think, foundational for all Western philosophical practice, were completely and definitively foreign to each other. After all, Platonism also raised the question of the true life in the form of an other existence. And we have seen that cynicism, precisely, could perfectly well connect up, combine, and occupy itself with philosophical speculations quite foreign to the primitive, rudimentary, and crude tradition of cynicism itself. So there was a constant interaction, and it is important to bear in mind the fact which has been crucial in the history of Western philosophy, morality, and spirituality, that Christianity, but also the Gnostic currents and around Christianity, were precisely movements in which one tried to think systematically and coherently the relationship between the other world and the life which is other. In the Gnostic movements, in Christianity, there was the attempt to think an other life, the life of severance and ascesis, without common measure with usual existence, as the condition for access to the other world. And it is this relation between an other life and the other world, so profoundly marked within Christian asceticism by the principle that it is an other life which leads to the other world, which is radically challenged in Protestant ethics and by Luther, which when access to the other world will be defined by a form of life absolutely conformable to existence in this world here. The formula of Protestantism is to lead the same life in order to arrive at the other world. It was at that point that Christianity became modern. We will stop for 3 minutes, and we will take up again afterwards the problem of the other life. That's the end of the first hour of Lecture 7 of The Courage of the Truth, lectures by Michel Foucault at the College of France, 1983-84.